Hi, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located in the world. Thank you for attending the CyberProof Security Thought Leadership webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions, you can ask them at any time. Please use the Ask Question tab located below the player. Your question will be addressed during the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. There are also some additional resources for you to check out under the Attachments tab below the player. You can download these items at any time. At the end of the webinar, please take a moment to rate this presentation and provide any feedback using the Rate This tab below the player. And finally, a recorded version of this presentation will be available using the same URL that you have shortly after we finished. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues. Now, I'm very excited to introduce the guest speakers today. Jeff Pollard, who is a VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester, and Tony Velleca, who is the CISO of UST Global and CEO of CyberProof. So take it away, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Howard. Thanks for having me today, and looking forward to spending time with everyone. What we wanted to focus on today are the results of a sponsored research initiative between CyberProof and Forrester, where we went out and surveyed security leaders and IT leaders to really understand how they are currently handling the impact of their digital transformation, services are helping them do that, and what things to look for from managed security services providers to ultimately improve what their organization is doing today. One of the most important things when you think about kind of improving your cybersecurity with help from your MSSP is making sure that you understand how your current environment is changing and ultimately how MSSPs are going to adapt to that change and help you prepare for it. I think one of the most interesting things that we found in the research is that 60% of firms found their MSSP relationship valuable today, but most of them felt that MSSPs needed to adapt to the changing security marketplace if they were going to continue to have value. They were going to need to respond to the new types of problems that their customers are facing, not the old problems that perhaps their customers might have originally selected them for if they had a relationship before this. Many providers might think about when they go in and talk to customers for the first time. I think in general, though, what I found hopeful about this is that so many organizations do find MSSP. And I talk to a lot of end user organizations, and sometimes the conversations I have with them are not always the most positive, right? Because it's rare that someone's going to call you and tell you great things about it. So this is why this gave me a little bit of hope, right? It's some perspective out there to really get some context from folks that are finding value in the relationship that they have today. But I think one of the big things that we also discovered in this is ultimately sort of the core set of capabilities or the biggest sort of desire that MSSP customers want from their MSSP. And it's something that I talk about a lot in my research, and it's something that I hear about a lot from the organizations that I speak with, and also echoed in the research that we did here, which is ultimately that a good managed security service provider, at the end of the day, helps security teams to work better, faster, and smarter, right? You make more accurate decisions, you make decisions more quickly, and you're ultimately able to handle more as an organization as the result of working with an MSSP. And this is actually a little counter to what a lot of MSSPs focus on when you're evaluating them, because a lot of MSSPs really focus on their ability to detect things. And that's important, right? The MSSP should certainly be good at that. But what we really find consistently echoed here in our research, most MSSP companies to find more things. They want an MSSP that finds more things and then helps their organization understand how to make decisions as a result of finding those things, right? So step one is sort of detection, but step two is integrating that into the workflow and making subsequent decisions after. And that's really what's most important And so as you think about potentially evaluating MSSPs or working with them today, what you really want to think about is how are they going to help you make better, faster, and smarter decisions, not so much how are they going to help you find things, right? It's really about understanding the outcome, not so much kind of the first stage issue. 53% of firms said that cybersecurity was highly critical to keeping them competitive in their particular industry. And this is another one that really sort of gives me a lot of hope out there, because when you think about the importance of cybersecurity and the importance of cybersecurity in terms of being competitive in an industry, this is something that is now on the upswing, right? 53% of organizations or 53% of firms saying that it's important today. But when you look historically, that wasn't always the case, right? So I think what this proves is that both security leaders, IT leaders, and executives, board members, et cetera, now all understand that security is something that matters more than simply being a back office cost center that doesn't have anything to do with kind of the day-to-day operations or the market competitiveness of the firm. I want that number to be higher, and I think that if we conduct this research in 2 years, it probably will be substantially higher than that, but it's definitely higher than it's been in the past, or it's definitely a change in terms of how people are thinking about the importance of security. And I think that has to give sort of technology leaders and security leaders a good bit of hope. But what that also means is we need to think about how we're expressing our contribution to the firm's overall competitiveness, and also how the supply chain of cybersecurity, including our MSSPs, are helping us ultimately make the case that we do contribute to our firm's competitiveness, right? So this also means that it's going to require us to make some changes out there. Most of the firms that we also surveyed said there was a pretty dangerous gap for them in terms of how they strategized around cybersecurity and how that interacted with the overall importance of cybersecurity at kind of an executive management and board level. So 81% said that cybersecurity was a top priority for their executive management and board members, but only 43% reported having a clearly defined cybersecurity strategy. And that's really bad, primarily because if you don't have a clear strategy and you can't measure that strategy and you can't articulate it, then ultimately when you do get in front of executive management and board members, you're not going to be effective in terms of your conversation, right? You're not going to be able to explain what you're doing and how that creates value for the firm. So, you know, it's pretty difficult to get 81% of cybersecurity pros to agree on anything, right? So the fact that that many said that, yeah, this is something that is important at the board level now, but then half that number, right, roughly half that number, said that they had a clearly defined cybersecurity strategy, is pretty frightening because it ultimately means that while we have our time in the spotlight, right, while we are having our chance to make our case for the importance of cybersecurity to the board, we're ultimately not able to fall back on something that allows us to clearly articulate what we're planning on doing, what we're currently doing today, and overall how that's contributing to the success of the organization. And I think that really boils down to part of the strategy, ultimately making sure that it allows you to close the gap between vulnerabilities that exist and the ability to detect those threats when you want to succeed. And again, this is something that MSSPs often talk about, but don't necessarily do a great job of equipping their customers to articulate how that creates value. But there's definitely a gap between the ability to find things and then the ability to respond to those and then articulate what that response achieved for the organization. And so we think this really needs to be a critical goal, and it's something that we uncovered in our research in terms of one of the most important things that firms were looking for from an MSSP perspective. Not surprisingly, lots of firms recognize that they have some degree of vulnerability to viruses and worms, right? So kind of standard issue malware infections. But at the same time, most firms also feel fairly confident in their ability to detect those, right? So standard issue kind of commodity malware out there, yes, it can certainly hit us, but we also feel pretty good about our ability to respond to that. But after that sort of basic level of infection is addressed, what we find is that most organizations do feel a high degree of vulnerability to other types of attacks out there, things like wire transfer fraud, ransomware, data breaches, general business disruptions, things like DDoS, et cetera. But their confidence in their ability to detect those things falls off drastically, right? So there's a pretty minimal gap between those and when you talk about commodity malware. But when you start talking about transfer fraud, ransomware, et cetera, you start to see big gaps, 15, 20, 25% between an organization's sort of perception of vulnerability to it, right? Their concern of whether or not they're ready for that kind of attack or whether that kind of attack could affect them, and then ultimately their ability to detect that attack as it occurs. And that's a pretty tremendous gap, and not that surprising. I think that this probably doesn't shock anyone. It certainly didn't shock us when we did the research. I think that what it does go to show, though, is that it's very difficult for security leaders and technology leaders to really have a high degree of confidence in their security program's ability to defend against things that are not legacy types of threats, to defend against things that they haven't seen time and time and time again, right? There's a high degree of confidence for that. But some of the other things out there, there just ultimately isn't a high degree of confidence in their firm's ability to deal with it. And that's part of where managed security service providers can ultimately come in and help them out, again, because part of the core of that mission is that they're able to find more things and able to detect things and then equip you to ultimately make decisions about those and respond to them. And so security is definitely dealing with, some of the legacy problems out there. And then when you look at what organizations are going to be planning over the next 12 months, right, what their top security priorities are, not surprising given the fact that organizations felt they were vulnerable to ransomware, but there was a bit of a gap between their ability to detect it. Enhancing disaster recovery capabilities is one of the things that organizations feel that they're going to prioritize over the next 12 months. But some of the other things that they're going to be doing are really sort of strategic initiatives, right? So after you get past that first sort of, we're going to deal with ransomware and part of that is disaster recovery, what you start to find is that organizations are going to be doing sort of assessments on their data and their technical infrastructure, right? So trying to get their hands around what they currently have, where their data is. But they're also going to be focusing on things like presenting the value of cybersecurity to executives in business terms, right? So trying to get more strategic and elevate the conversation about cybersecurity. Also beginning to think about the data that they own and really adopting a data-centric approach to security. So not thinking about security architectures from the standpoint of network architecture and access control lists, but instead really focusing on securing data as opposed to securing networks and infrastructure. And again, that's a definite change in terms of what security organizations are doing today compared to the decisions that they made in the past, especially in terms of what we see in our research. So I think it's interesting that outside of the first thing there that really is the response to a new attack type that organizations aren't confident in their ability to deal with, and certainly if you follow the news, a lot of the city organizations, municipal organizations out there are certainly struggling with ransomware. What we find after that is really things that focus on changing up business value, changing up security architecture, and changing up security plans to be a bit more strategic. But of course, if you do that, then part of what you're going to need is that you're going to need an MSSP that can help take some of those responsibilities on so that way you can focus on some more of these strategic initiatives. So when you think about partnerships, part of what you want to do is ultimately kind of get out there and find an MSSP and a services partner that will allow you to focus on these more strategic activities that you're undertaking. And so part of what we wanted to explore in that and kind of understanding what organizations are going to be doing in the future, one of the things that I found super interesting is kind of finding out what are people using today from a managed security services perspective. And I think what we find here is that a lot of organizations are making use of things like cyber risk assessments, real-time monitoring, so kind of, taking log data in, analyzing it, some threat intelligence, and then kind of security system management. So when you think about, sort of the core set of MSSP capabilities, you sort of see that list here. But then what we also asked respondents about is what they valued in terms of the MSSP services, right? So which of the services were the most valued out there? And a couple of these actually surprised me quite a bit. Security system management in particular, I thought was rather surprising, being number one, primarily because, one of the things you find out there is things like, managed firewall, managed IDS, IPS, technologies like that. What you tend to find is that those are fairly, old security services, right? That doesn't make them bad. In fact, obviously that makes them really valuable, but they've been around for a long time, right? Sort of the first MSSPs started managing firewalls, 20, 25 years ago. But what you see is that when that's done right and when that's done well, it still rises up to be one of the most valued security services out there, right? So there are MSSPs that have moved away from that. There are organizations that are moving away from managing technology altogether and maybe giving that back to IT from kind of a security leader perspective. But what you'll find is that when MSSPs do that well, it becomes a really high value service. And then things like vulnerability intelligence and vulnerability management up there. So again, providing visibility and helping organizations understand what's in their environment. Also cyber risk assessments. So the ability to kind of understand what your risk profile is. And then, another one that isn't really surprising, incident response, right? And that can take the form of managed detection and response, or it can take the form of, kind of IR as a service with retainers and whatnot. But obviously, when you have a crisis, when you have a catastrophe, bringing an MSSP that can help you, something that's really important. So not too surprising that that's a really valued MSSP service because it's a highly specialized service. But I think the key there is that security technology has only gotten more complex. We have more of it. And, working with an MSSP that can help you offload some of the management responsibility for that is something that you can really value if your service is conducted well and conducted properly. Then we wanted to find out, what do organizations find challenging in working with an MSSP? What are some of the top complaints? And the first is that, too expensive and not valuable. And I think that's a really important one, because that too expensive and not valuable, that can mean different things, right? And in general, what I hear is that the not valuable portion is the part that, organizations really struggle with, in part because, going back to where we started, MSSPs aren't doing a great job of helping their customers articulate the value of their service to the rest of the organization, right? And so in that situation, if your services provider is not helping you do that, then, they can seem like they don't give you much value, even though they do. But there are some other ones that are big, and these are actually the ones that I tend to find often out there, especially when people maybe don't do a thorough job of kind of vetting their MSSP partner. Inflexible one-size-fits-all models. MSSPs are an economy of scale business, and so that means customization is sometimes limited. And if you aren't able to customize your service to what you need, that can be a real problem. And we see that echoed by the difficult nature to integrate with existing internal workflows, right? So the ability to kind of plug the existing MSSP into maybe a current incident response playbook. But one of the things I often find when I talk to organizations out there is that sometimes they'll admit that's their fault, right? That they didn't necessarily take the time to sit down and programmatically kind of plan out how they should adjust workflows to the MSSP, right? So there's a difficulty there, but sometimes that's caused by the organization itself and not necessarily caused by the MSSP, though they certainly do contribute to it, right? And so as you think about MSSP partners, one of the most important things to do is sit down and figure out, okay, what's going to change as a result of adopting this? What do we need to differentiate in our current program and plan in order to really work well with this MSSP? Because if you don't do that, you'll wind up with a disconnect in terms of how you work with them. And again, firms that really struggle to show the value of the MSSPs really struggle because they butt up against those inflexible models and the fact that the MSSP can't integrate with existing workflows. And I wanted to call this out a second time because as you find sort of what I would describe as kind of toxic MSSP relationships, right? Things where it's just gone wrong, what I tend to find is that these rise up to be kind of the core issues, right? The service is just not built the way that the customer wants it or needs it, and then the customer ultimately can't find a way to integrate that into the existing choices that they have made in their current workflow. And this is only going to get more problematic, especially in terms of workflow integration, as you think about things like automation and orchestration, right? Because that becomes sort of the technology aspect of a process, right? So a human-driven process is what we often have in a lot of security operations centers today. But as automation takes hold, that's going to become a technology-driven process with humans involved. And if MSSPs can't integrate into those workflows, that's a real problem moving forward. So that's definitely something to kind of keep your eyes on. And then when we asked sort of respondents to think about what they felt was important from an MSSP, then ultimately what created value or what they felt like was missing from their MSSP, so how value wasn't created, you'll see that there's some consistency here, right? So what most people go into the process thinking about is that they really want an MSSP with end-to-end breach services, right? So the ability to detect, the ability to add some context, and the ability to respond. What they found is that there's a lot of overpromise and underdeliver there because a lot of MSSPs don't actually have that capability, right? They might say they do, or they ultimately, can't quite do everything that the customer wants. But some of the things that organizations, found valuable once they began were things like the technical innovations, which was an important criteria for them. Things that was kind of low from the important criteria at the beginning, but when actually exploring what people found valuable, being able to get out in front of things, being less reactive and more proactive became something that organizations really found valuable in working with their MSSP, right? So I think that's an example of where sometimes our plan to buy something isn't necessarily matched up against what happens when we actually buy it and start using it, right? Because things, you buy them, you use them, and sometimes we have different expectations in parts of that purchase process. And so what we found here is that being proactive actually wound up being one of the most valuable things, but wasn't necessarily one of the most important things when organizations were kind of making that initial exploration of an MSSP out there. And the business benefits that organizations expected when working with an MSSP, first off, they wanted to reduce the frequency of breaches, right? So they wanted less breaches overall, which I think is a noble goal and something that's definitely aspirational and we should look to. But they also wanted to reduce their spend when remediating breaches, right? So ultimately, when they had a breach, they wanted to detect it earlier and faster so that way they could make those better, more accurate decisions. And so that instead of it being a crisis and a catastrophe that wound up with sort of months of remediation, they were able to sort of interdict the adversary, contain it, remediate it, respond to it much, much faster, which ultimately leads to a breach costing less, right? Because the earlier you detect an attacker, obviously the less expensive it is, right? But they also wanted some things like improving customer acquisition and retention, right? So you can think about that almost as like the third party angle. Because they were able to work with an MSSP, those security leaders wanted to be able to handle things like third party risk more effectively, questionnaires, helping sales teams understand the security implications of their products and services so that way they could actually help the organization generate more revenue, right? So it's important to kind of note here from a respondent perspective that organizations didn't just have those core security use cases of detecting breaches and minimizing response costs. They also wanted to find a way when they bought an MSSP to also contribute to the business itself, right? They wanted to find a way to use that service to help them acquire and retain customers, right, by raising their security profile. And so that's a really important goal to think about. If you're looking at MSSPs and you only have technical requirements, you're probably not thinking completely about exactly what that MSSP may wind up being able to do for you. So kind of something to consider there. That's it for my portion. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony. Tony, take it away.
Sounds good. And Jeff, thank you so much for that. It's been a pleasure working with you on this study. One of the things, as we started CyberProof, just to give everybody a little bit of a background here, and as I learned how to switch the slides, the CyberProof is part of UST Global. UST Global is a leading enterprise provider of end-to-end IT services and solutions. And one of the cornerstones of UST Global is that it creates long-term strategic relationships with our clients. As part of that, we help many clients through their digital journeys. They're trying to figure out as they transform from brick and mortar companies into digital companies what this means, but they realize very quickly that cybersecurity becomes a strategic part of that. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, cybersecurity is important to being competitive in their industry. So it moved from more of a back office to a front office type of problem. And we noticed that, and we said, what can we do to get ahead of it? And this is why we worked very closely with Jeff and found that, he and Forrester had really a great understanding of the market and the detailed challenges. And we said, as we're forming CyberProof, how do we understand the market better than our competition and adjust to it? So CyberProof, what we do is we provide SOC services that helps with event management, incident identification, and incident management. We leverage our own purpose-built security platform as part of our service, and that enables transparent collaboration with our clients and automation of incident handling. And that, in turn, reduces the costs associated with the incident management, but also the time to respond, which is a major outcome. The reduction in time to response, we believe, helps minimize the impact of an incident and thereby quantifiably reduces the business risk to the enterprise. Now, part of the challenges in developing that model are understanding how we measure success, how we provide measurable value to our customers, and this is where some of the research has helped us tremendously. So what I wanted to do now is shift. We're also taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions today, please go ahead and put them into the chat window. But let me start with a couple of questions. First of all, over the last several years, what we've seen in the market is an explosion of solutions being purchased. And as you know, cybersecurity is a layered approach. And so many customers have added more and more layers of solutions coming out of the, explosion of the innovative types of solutions in the market. But as a result of that, what you're seeing in the security operations teams are more and more alerts because these solutions often generate alerts, and you have to figure out how to respond and look at this data. So you noted in the research that firms were less confident in their ability to respond to certain types of attacks, like business disruption and data breach attacks. And these types of attacks often happen over longer periods of time. So, Jeff, the question for you is really based on the research. Are you seeing a shift to more of a focus on speed of the response and recovery rather than the prevention side of the business and the research?
Yeah, I think it's an arms race, right? So as prevention solutions get more sophisticated, attacker techniques adapt, right? Attackers can use ML and AI and automation the same way that that enterprises and security products can. In fact, in many cases, they could probably use it faster than those organizations because they probably don't have rigid change control the way that an enterprise does. And so as a result of that, what really happens is that it sort of highlights in a cycle the importance of response and recovery, in addition to prevention, right? So they really become augmentative and they drive each other. And so I think the growth of services like managed detection and response in particular really kind of illustrates that, right? That, for all of the sophistication that you have in prevention, attackers are going to adapt. They are going to be able to bypass things. They're going to get creative. And so in that scenario, you have to think about your ability to respond and recover, and especially the speed of those things, right, to minimize those costs. So that way, when the attacker circumvents the prevention solution that you invested in, you're not left, with nothing, right? You do have some ability to interact and some ability to recover from that. So I think short answer, we definitely are, and I think it's driven by that cycle of the more sophisticated prevention technologies get, the more sophisticated attackers become in circumventing those, which means you need response and recovery.
Fantastic. So the next thing, as you mentioned, our view was the MSSP market was driven out of the need to meet regulatory requirements in many industries. So, if even we looked at our industry as an IT service provider, we were required to have a SIM, and we were required to monitor that SIM, and that was the That was a primary requirement. As companies moved into digital and as they added more and more endpoints, we found that there was a shifting need to actually focusing on more than just the regulatory requirement. You also noted in your research that security teams valued things like incident response, vulnerability intelligence, and cyber risk assessments, and those were not typically part of the classic MSSP service. What types of changes do you expect in the role of an MSSP when it comes to innovation, automation, and delivering measurable values? How can we address some of those in the MSSP market?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, when it comes to innovation, the way that I describe kind of the legacy MSSP world, and I worked in that world for about 10 to 12 years before joining Forrester, I described those MSSPs as kind of your mess for less MSSPs, right? It was kind of the age of your mess for less, in that MSSPs used words like agnostic and neutral, and they would effectively take over the stuff you had, right? But they weren't prescriptive. They didn't make technology recommendations necessarily. They were all about sort of managing and monitoring the stuff you had to the degree that they supported it. I think what's happening now is that, you know, MSSPs are really having to become IP companies, right? They're having to do their own innovation. They're having to build their own technologies so that they can provide value for customers. Some of that's because, you know, on some occasions, security products may not, you know, adapt quickly enough to things like cloud, as an example. But in other circumstances, I think it happens in part because product companies are also launching services, right? So we're seeing, you know, endpoint companies launch MDR services, for example, and, you know, sort of the value that they believe they bring to the table is because they have an endpoint agent. Now, in general, I think that having services expertise and incident response and forensics expertise is really important to do something like MDR. I think that having an endpoint agent is necessary, but being an endpoint company doesn't make you great at it, right? But that's part of it. So there's some competition there. I think automation, the sort of source of an alert, right? So they chimed and said something happened. Here's what we know about it. Here's what it did. Maybe here's what it tried to do. And you would sort of let the customer know that, and you would give them a list and say, okay, you know, go reload some machines, put some machines in an isolated zone on the network, whatever it may be. Right now with automation, you know, MSSPs can gather all of those artifacts on their own, but they can also initiate response actions, right? They might be able to block command and control traffic on a firewall. And so what's ultimately going to change with that when it comes to automation is that instead of MSSPs alerting you to something happening, what they're ultimately going to really be measured by from a customer perspective is their ability to resolve the issue, not to find it, but to actually resolve it. And so that's where automation, APIs, programmatic interfaces between the MSSP and their customer environments are going to become really important. And MSSPs have a lot of work to be ready, to get ready for that, especially legacy MSSPs, because they really just weren't built for it. And then all of that sort of combines in terms of measurable value to be able to express the sort of quantifiable aspect of what the MSSP did for you, right? So if you leveraged them for some of this automation, what value did that create? But also, what did they allow your team to do instead of that you were able to create value for the business, right? So it's not just an MSSP problem. It's also how do they equip a security leader to define that value to the rest of the organization?
Fantastic. You know, it's interesting. You noticed this in your research that customers were looking for more flexibility from managed security providers. And, you know, we get asked this question all the time. You know, people are fairly aware that there's a lack of probably experienced talent when it comes to IT security, and the threats exploding. But how is this showing up? How are MSSPs adapting to this need for more flexibility?
So I think part of what they're doing, certainly automation and things like that, you know, using security orchestration and automation tools is one side of that from a technology perspective. I think the other thing that's happening is MSSPs are trying to get more creative in their delivery models. What we often sort of term as hybrid delivery models, where, you know, they are putting people on site to help drive the service, but it's not an outsourcing model, right? It's not a model where sort of everything is with the MSSP. Instead, it's more of a co-sourcing, or like I said, what we're now kind of calling a hybrid model, where you get someone that's, sort of half SOC analyst, maybe half sort of SIM technologist, if you will, or SIM content writer, right? And those folks sort of drive the day-to-day use of the service, but then they're backed up on a 24/7 basis by the sort of traditional multi-tenant delivery model that we're kind of used to in the MSSP world. I also think that, SaaS models and cloud marketplaces also have an effect on this, right? So their ability to sort of ultimately plug into, cloud-based models and take more of a SaaS type approach to MSS, or a managed SaaS approach, is also transforming that. But I think the major thing that I see right now is more of that hybrid delivery model, where the MSSP isn't just thinking of themselves as far away from the organization. Instead, they're putting people on site, and those people are backed up in that multi-tenant model, so that way they can offer the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and related to that, one of the challenges with a vendor-client relationship is as you get more flexible and you provide these more collaborative models, how do you measure the outcome in terms of performance? Today's standard around service level agreements generally focus on how fast you respond to an event or an alert and then escalate that. Those are becoming irrelevant as we get more automation and bots are taking up types of services. So as we get more collaborative and engagement model, how do we measure value? What are customers looking for in terms of value measures?
So that's the hardest question of all, and I never want to say it depends, but here's what I'll tell you. I think one of the most important things that MSSPs and customers are trying to do now is come together on exactly how customers are doing that themselves, and ultimately what that means is what metrics is the organization currently using to prove their value or their ability to sort of perform security for the organization and how that contributes. Those metrics are often sort of not fully fleshed out or not entirely useful. And so what ultimately happens is that you kind of find a little bit of a joint exercise between the MSSP and between their customers to say, okay, what are the big strategic initiatives that the organization has today? What are the things that are kind of most important? If you're a publicly traded company, what's in the 10K, right? Okay, how is security contributing to those things? And then ultimately, how is your MSSP allowing you to do that, either directly or indirectly? So it's really a joint exercise, right? I think that the biggest thing for customers to think about as you look at your MSSP and as you look at this problem yourself is that there isn't anything that you are going to buy specifically. There's no product. There's no magic bullet to do this for you. It is going to take some elbow grease. It's going to take some work, right? You've got to refine your metrics. You've got to understand what's important to your business in terms of what it measures and what it considers valuable. And then you have to think about how you can measure that within your security program to show hopefully a direct contribution, but at a minimum kind of an indirect contribution. So I think the answer is the way that MSSPs are doing it is not by a single portal or not by a single type of service. Instead, what they're really doing is taking the time to sit down with their customers and better understand their environment, better understand how they're measuring things and what their organization is doing, and then together with some teamwork, designing something that makes sense to accomplish that objective. Definitely not easy, but absolutely necessary and valuable when done right.
I'm going to shift here. We have some related questions from the audience. I think this one you may have partially answered, but I'll go ahead and throw it out here. The audience asks, what sort of quantifiable benefits can be gained, in parentheses, prevention, detection, or response, by outsourcing cyber protection to an MSSP?
Well, so I'm going to challenge that answer, or I'm going to challenge that question a little bit, because that's actually one of the biggest problems I find with organizations when they are trying to create those measurables, right? So what's mentioned there in terms of those elements, they're all certainly, operational or even tactical kind of security measurables, right? Those are things that from the inside of a security program are incredibly important. I absolutely won't disagree with that. But I think that if your goal is to show that quantifiable benefit to the organization, then that's only about halfway down that road, right? Because I'm less interested, for example, in when I work with security leaders and when I work with board members and CIOs that might have CISOs report to them, that's often the place they start. Let's count the number of incidents. Let's count the detection. Let's count how fast we responded. So again, those are super useful. Like, you absolutely should capture those, and that's part of your strategy. But part of what I also stress them is don't stop there, right? That's necessary but not sufficient, because what the next step should be, or the next thing you should think about is, okay, if you're looking at the speed with which you were able to respond to threats this month over last month, for example, again, important, but what I also want to know is, okay, did those threats come from a particular business unit or a particular application or a particular source of revenue or a region, right? So what you really want to do, and this is why you can't simply rely on your MSSP, is that what you really want to do is take the next step. And as you can tell, I'm fairly passionate about metrics, and it's one of the research areas I lead here. What you want to do is take that next step and say, okay, we were able to respond to events faster last month than the month before. Great. But what we actually discovered is that the incidents that take us the most time to respond to are actually incidents that originate out of this geographic region, or they're incidents that originate within this business unit. And once you start being able to do that, once you link that kind of security measurable to that business concept of region or product line or initiative, what winds up happening in that situation is now you've created something that allows you to go in front of the board or in front of other executive leaders and say, you know, it turns out that, you know, we actually struggle the most in responding to incidents that originate in APAC. And we think that's because, or we know that's because we have less telemetry, less instrumentation, whatever, right? Or maybe Europe is an issue because you can't have the same telemetry there because of privacy concerns or whatnot. And you start being able to build a case that shows not only did we resolve incidents, but the ones where we struggled were actually due to X, Y, and Z, and so I'm going to make a business case to solve that. So sure, I think the standard sort of measurables and quantifiable things like, you know, vulnerability remediation, you know, number of incidents, the speed with which you respond to them, sure, those are all a starting place, but don't just stop there, right? Extend it a little bit more, and that's when you really start creating value.
That's a great response. I'm actually going to switch over to another question from the audience, and because this is a great one and one that we're seeing. One of the just to preface the question, you know, we've noticed every year we go to RSA or a different event, and the topic has changed. And every 6 months, you know, it's changed from threat intelligence to vulnerability management to something else. So the dynamic environment is almost changing faster than we can switch topics. But this is kind of one of the things I've also been hearing from customers, and I know, Jeff, you mentioned some of this in your research, some different research. In today's dynamic cloud environment, does it require a new approach to cybersecurity? With DevOps, microservices, and containers and other developments in the current IT environment, how does I guess it's directed at me, CyberProof plan to meet this in the market demand? But before I answer this question from a CyberProof angle, it'd be great to kind of get your perspective on what's happening with cloud and application security.
Yeah, so, you know, I tend to be a little cynical, at least with cloud, right? So cloud is definitely different. You need to think about sort of the impact of cloud or how cloud changes things in terms of instrumentation and telemetry. But at the end of the day, it's infrastructure somewhere else. And so you may not be able to get the same data out of it that you might have gotten in an on-prem environment. But at the same time, it's not wholesale different, right? It's not a completely different world. It's just a different kind of infrastructure or a different kind of software. And so you want to make sure that your MSSPs can work with that they can support it. And you want to make sure that your processes you know, are realistic. One of the things I often find with organizations, for example, is that if they have an IR plan for, you know, response, right? So part of their playbook is how to respond to a certain application attack. If it's an on-prem attack, they often have sort of one set of processes, but then when it comes from the cloud, it's, okay, if you want NetFlow, are you going to be able to get that, right? Do you have the same level of instrumentation, the same type of telemetry in cloud versus on-prem? And a lot of organizations suddenly find, oh, wait, I might be able to get that information, but it's actually a ticket I have to open and it takes 4 hours to get it back. And so now my IR process has a delay in it that I didn't count on, right? So you certainly have to adjust and adapt to that. And you want to make sure your service providers can work in that world, that they don't treat cloud as something different. And that's been a huge indictment in the MSSP industry, is that it took them a long time to get ready for cloud and treat it as kind of a native environment. But a big part of that is, just understanding that, again, it's infrastructure somewhere else. You need to modify your processes and procedures the way you would anywhere. I think one of the most, important things about DevOps to understand is that, A, it's orchestration and automation built in, right? That's the essence of kind of microservices and DevOps. And ultimately, that what DevOps is going to mean is that you're probably going to have more code written by more people and deployed more often than ever before. So if you had problems with application security before DevOps, then it's only going to get worse. In much the same way that if you had problems with visibility before IoT exacerbated that issue, well, DevOps is going to do the same thing. So if you had issues before, you're going to have even more issues now. And that's the real problem for most organizations, I find, is that they weren't entirely comfortable with AppSec before DevOps, and now that DevOps is rolled out, it's even more difficult for them to get their arms around, because it does, again, more code, more releases, more pushes to production, and so now you have an even bigger problem to fulfill. And so I think what MSSPs can ultimately do is, one, treat those environments as if they aren't different, but two, take them into account in terms of how they're delivering the service and be ready with automation and orchestration, for example, to work with that.
Yeah, and that's a great response. And just to kind of address what CyberProof is doing, we found in our market that it's showing up. I look at the DevSecOps as analogous to vulnerability management. How do we now look upstream into the development cycle to make sure we're not pushing security defects into our environment? And I think we're seeing that CISOs can't simply say in this new digital world, no, we're not going to release this application to production because it's got a security defect. The business aspects are becoming more and more important. So we're seeing that it translates to, I have a known defect going into production, and we need a secondary control to monitor for it until we can roll out a patch or something in that arena. The other thing that we're seeing is that application teams on the client side rarely talk to the security operations team, so there's not a really good communication channel for even if there are no defects, passing those on to the other side. So we have been, because the parent company USC Global works closely on the application development side, we've also integrated those processes so that we can look at DevOps with security included and kind of manage the cycle of testing for security vulnerabilities. So let me shift over. We've got more questions. Obviously, you can't talk about security with really talking about artificial intelligence. I think it's one of those topics that's over. People are tired of hearing. But the question here is, what can machines do better than people, and what can they not do? And how do you see this kind of showing up in this whole world of MSSPs?
Yeah, so I don't lead our ML and AI research. I would defer to some of my colleagues for that. But I think at the core, what I would say about ML and AI in particular, they're good at sort of looking at vast amounts of data and identifying similarities once they're trained to, right? Once humans train them to, and kind of understand what looks like what else. I think that what ML and AI can't do is ultimately contextualize that. At least most implementations of ML and AI, they can't contextualize those things, right? And let me give you an example of that. So let's say that you have two infections come into an environment. You've got two systems that are equally bad off, and one of those hits the sort of fabled CFO's laptop, and one of those hits the fabled CIO's laptop, right? Now, if you're a limited bandwidth security operation, you have two different infections, potentially two different methods, potentially two different attackers. Which one of those do you prioritize, right? Which one of those is 100th, or which one of those is kind of most critical? And the reason why I asked that question from an ML and AI perspective is, guess what? If you have an asset management system or you have VIPs listed in a sort of asset management or user system like a ServiceNow or something else, then both of those individuals and the systems that they use are probably the same level, right? The CFO probably has the same criticality as the CIO or COO or whoever. They're both probably treated as VIPs, right? They have that flag. Well, okay, if you're currently working incidents and you're at capacity, which one of those do you pick first, right? Because ML and AI, let's say that the importance of the asset or the individual are programmed into that system. Well, they both flagged them now the same way, right? Because they can't figure out that the CIO is incredibly important, but the CFO has access to all the money, right? That certain decisions can be made in finance that can't necessarily be made by the CIO. And so you might want to triage that CFO system before the CIOs. But again, if your sort of math and algorithms behind ML and AI haven't taken those things into account, they don't have that sort of micro context about what to do, then effectively what happens is human beings get the same criticality alert in front of them, right? So I think that machines are always going to be better at sorting through vast amounts of information quickly. I think what the people have to really do to help the machines is ultimately those little minor nuanced decisions that when we rely on, technology to make, technology is going to treat things the same way. And that's ultimately where people are much better at doing it. And then finally, I think the other aspect of this is that, human beings are better often at figuring out sort of why a machine is doing something wrong that it shouldn't do. Recently, a big cloud provider wrote a regex rule, and that rule ate up all the CPU on their devices, and the internet was down for a few minutes, right? Or at least their customers were down for a few minutes, which is a big chunk of the internet. A person had to troubleshoot that, right? People had to look at it and say, okay, the CPU usage is high. A machine can tell you that, of course, but why is it high? That took a person to figure out what was going on. So those are the two examples I think are maybe sort of most indicative of what we're going to have people do versus machines.
Fantastic. So we have two more questions, so I'll go ahead and read them off. But one of them is often managed security providers provide security as sort of a black box. I think the events come in and alerts come out the other side. How can an MSSP provide that in-depth visibility to about the security operation?
Yeah, so I think from a customer perspective, the answer is you can't if they don't let you. So picking a different one is often the only answer. It's one of the things I rant and rail about MSSPs most often, as a matter of fact, because MSSPs do a lot of work in the background for customers. They do a lot of things for you when they're surfacing alerts and events to you, but they often hide that information. They don't tell you about it. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, most of us in our career, if we think about it, we want to tell our boss all the awesome stuff we did because we want to look good for them. And MSSPs, for some reason, decided not to do that, which is part of that maybe not having a lot of value, right? Because they don't make things transparent enough. So if you're in that situation with an MSSP, first thing is ask them what they can expose to you or what they're willing to expose to you. But if the answer is you get what you get, which is all too often, unfortunately, the answer, then the only solution is pick a different one that will show that information to you, that will show all of the work that they've done on your behalf, right? So unfortunately, it's kind of a fatalistic answer, but the truth is, as a customer, you can only get what your MSSP is willing to give you. You can't force them to share more, and they may have great reasons why they won't share the information. But when a company decides to not be transparent as a customer, there's not much we can do about that except to pick a different company.
Fantastic, and I'll pass on the last one here. What should an enterprise, how should an enterprise choose the right MSSP? I guess, what should they look at? How does an enterprise compare offerings when there's so many, hundreds of MSSPs out there?
Yeah, so just for the sake of time, because this one is also pretty complex, as you can imagine, I'll sort of share the sort of three things that I talk to organizations about when they're looking at an MSSP or when they're looking to maybe investigate having an MSSP, right? So first off, the thing you should do before you even decide to evaluate MSSPs is you really need to look at kind of three things. What things do you not want to do? What things should you not do? And what things would you rather have someone else do? Right, and those are not all the same, right? There are things that you shouldn't do as a security team. Insider threat investigations is one of those that's often a hot topic. Should security investigate HR issues or not? That's a reasonable question. That's something companies have to decide every individual company has to decide on. The things that you shouldn't do, right? Stuff that you're not good at, you don't have the skills, the things that you can't do, right? So you just don't have the people or the ability to do it. And then things you'd rather not do, right? You'd rather spend your time doing something else that you think is more valuable. Once you figure out those things, once you figure out sort of that framework, that lets you start figuring out, okay, what kind of MSSP do I need? If I should not do insider threat investigations, then maybe that means you look at an MDR provider that has skill with insider threats. So maybe you don't even look at a classic MSSP, you look at more managed detection and response. What you can't do, so the things you don't have the skills for, maybe you don't have the skills for IR at all. And so suddenly that MDR provider, you want one that has both incident response capability and insider threat capabilities, right? You want someone that can do both. But then if you add in the things that you don't want to do or the things you'd rather not do, you don't want to manage firewalls. Well, suddenly now those MDR providers that only do those kind of investigative things, they may not be sufficient. Now you need an MSSP that has MDR because now you've chosen that you want them to do some of that security system management. So I think that the thing that you have to do before you even select an MSSP is decide what you want your security team to be, right? What you want them to focus on and the capabilities you want to nurture and harvest and the things you want to give away. And then what you want to do is find an MSSP that can plug into the choices that you've made that will complement your strengths, cover up your weaknesses, right? Or negate your weaknesses. That's how you select the right MSSP. And what I find a lot of times is organizations decide we're going to go with an MSSP before they've decided what kind of security program they want to have, and that's where you wind up with big mistakes.
Well, since we have time, and this is the catch-all question, but when you did this study, I know you always have expectations and you talk to customers all the time, what do you think surprised you the most out of the results of the study that you may or may not have expected?
I would say that 53% of folks recognizing that cybersecurity was an important kind of element of their competitive differentiator. It surprised me in a couple of ways. One, as I said, it should be higher. It's disappointing that it isn't. So from that standpoint, it's surprising that it's low. At the same time, talking to end users every day, I've been at Forrester for about 4 years now, I also recognize that it's also really high in comparison to what it would have been, say, 2 to 3 to 4 years ago. And so it's both a surprisingly high but also disappointingly low stat at kind of the same time. So it's a little bittersweet. I'd say that's probably the most surprising.
Well, it's fantastic. I think we're also seeing that in the market, but I just personally want to thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you, Jeff and Forrester, on this research.
Same. It's been great working with the CyberProof team.
Great. So that's pretty much all we have time for today. Many thanks to Jeff and Tony for your insights. This was really great. And to all the participants for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day.